Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this wonderful conference. I originally entitled this speech as The War on Concepts, but actually it would be more accurate to call it The War on Our Freedoms, The War on Liberty, which I think is very apposite for this conference indeed. And I want to explain why. Alfredo mentioned in his introduction a number of key areas which are of concern, which I will touch on in a little detail, but then move on to look at probably the first and worst war that has been waged against our freedom, in fact the whole world's freedom, over the last 50 years, which has failed, which is the war on drugs. So my background, as he mentioned, was as an MI5 intelligence officer. Now, MI5 in the UK is the Domestic Security Service, although it has global reach to investigate the war on terror these days. I was recruited decades ago. I'm getting that old. I was recruited in 1990 to work there, and I was there for 6 years. And during that time, I met a man called David Shaler, who became my partner as well as my colleague. And after 6 years within that organisation, we were so disgusted at the crimes and the incompetence that we had seen going on in this very secret organisation in the UK that we decided to resign, and we decided to go public, to blow the whistle. And in fact, we did an early version of Edward Snowden, because we preemptively went on the run before the story hit the media. We went on the run around Europe for a month. We ended up living in exile in a remote French farmhouse for a year. We ended up living in exile again in Paris, more openly, for 2 years. And my partner went to prison not once but twice. David was arrested when they tried to extradite him from France in 1998 and put in prison. He was then released because the French in those days did not extradite people for whistleblowing because they deemed that to be a political action, as indeed it is. He then voluntarily returned to the UK in 2000 to face trial because under the Official Secrets Act in the UK, if you have ever worked for the intelligence agencies and you ever say anything to anyone outside those intelligence agencies about your work, you are automatically the criminal. It doesn't matter if... Ooh. It doesn't matter if you're reporting the crimes of the spies. So he returned to the UK, he faced trial, he was of course found guilty, and he went back to prison. And we paid a very high price for exposing the crimes of the spies. We paid a very high price professionally. We lost our jobs, of course, we became unemployable. And we had to live in exile, we had to face arrest, he had to go to prison, and we also had to stand by and watch our friends and family be arrested around us too, for supporting us. We had to watch when journalists who were covering the stories we were disclosing were arrested and in some cases prosecuted for exposing the crimes of the spies. And we even saw a student activist arrested for reporting on one of his stories. In fact, she was sitting in a lecture theatre like this one day in London, and the secret police came marching in and dragged her out of the lecture theatre and arrested her for a breach of the Official Secrets Act. So this is what happens when you annoy the spy agencies, even in a so-called Western democracy like the UK. But it gets worse because, as we've seen over the last few years, with a whole string of whistleblowers coming out of the intelligence agencies in America, not least Chelsea Manning, who exposed war crimes and embarrassment of the American government, but also, of course, most famously, Edward Snowden, who has, in my view, done the world a huge service by exposing the rampant criminality of our out-of-control spy agencies. These whistleblowers face 35 years in prison for exposing the crimes of others. I call them heroes or heroines. So, through the process of blowing the whistle, of going on the run, of having to deal with the media, and since then working with some of these more modern whistleblowers, it's given me quite an insight into a number of key, and in my view, interrelated areas. First of all, the war on terror. There's also what I would call the war on whistleblowers, particularly in the United States of America now, where whistleblowers, as I said, face 35 years in prison for exposing the crimes of the spies. And crucially as well, in this new era of the internet, there is a war on our digital freedoms. There is a war indeed on the internet. And this is crucial because we have a situation now where the internet is the nervous system for our countries. It's the nervous system for our modern societies. We live our lives online. And yet it's being attacked from two directions. First of all, by the corporations, particularly the big media conglomerates in America, who for the last 20 years now have been waging a war to stop people illegally downloading films or books or music online. And because they want to fight to protect their copyright, which is ludicrously overinflated, 75 years plus, whatever, because they want to protect an outdated 20th century business model, they have enlisted the spies and the government powers to snoop on the internet to see if we are illegally downloading our latest favorite song or a film or something. And they are demanding the most intrusive ways of looking at our communications to protect their copyright. And this is up to and including deep packet inspection of the bits of information that are streaming through the internet. On the other hand, we now know as well, because of Snowden, the sheer scale of what the spies and the governments are doing to try and monitor what we are sending and listen and read what we are communicating over the internet. And again, this is Orwellian. In fact, it's worse than Orwellian. I think what Snowden has revealed is, a dystopia that even Orwell could not have begun to dream of. We have a situation where the UK spies, for example, GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters, which is like the American NSA, hoovers up all the information that comes across the transatlantic fiber optic cables. This is an operation called Tempora. And this means that GCHQ, which then shares this information with the NSA and the other Five Eyes countries, which is Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, this means that they grab every piece of communication between North America and Europe. Now, when this was revealed back in 2013, our Foreign Secretary said, "Oh, it's all legal. I signed a warrant. I know exactly what the spies are doing." However, under UK law, yes, he can sign a warrant to allow the spies to spy on specific targets or specific groups when they make a strong case to do so. He cannot sign off on a warrant that covers the entirety of the UK legally. But he said he did. He said he could. He said it was all okay. However, it gets worse because not only did whatever he signed allow GCHQ to snoop on the whole of the UK's communications, it also allowed GCHQ to snoop on the whole of Europe's communications between North America and Europe. So where on earth does a foreign secretary elected in the UK get off thinking that he has the right to sign a warrant to snoop on 500 million of us when he's barely elected by the UK population? And yet this is what the spies are getting up to. Now, just before I move off this internet topic, one issue I do want to raise is many people will say to me, well, I'm doing nothing wrong, I've got nothing to hide. Well, one, I would turn that back on our governments and say, if you're doing nothing wrong, mateys, why didn't you have nothing to hide? They never seem to apply that rule to themselves. However, it's not about doing anything wrong. It's about wanting privacy. And again, this is another disclosure from Edward Snowden, something called optic nerve. Has anyone heard of this operation? No, it's a bit of an obscure one. This was basically a disclosure saying that the Yahoo video conferencing system was compromised, and GCHQ, the UK spy agency, could gather all this information of video conferencing in real time and watch it. And I'm sure they can do it with other sorts of video conferencing systems too. Now, it turns out that in this modern era, when many of us have long-distance relationships, we might live in other countries from our partner for a week or two or something, many of us use these services for, shall we say, very intimate types of conversation. In fact, I would go as far as to say pornographic types of conversation. And there's nothing wrong. These people are doing nothing wrong. Of course not. They're in consensual adult relationships, enjoying themselves. However, as soon as you say that to anyone, if you're doing this over the internet, would you want the spies to be watching this? It turns out that 10% of their video capture was pornographic. Now, I don't know about you, but I certainly would not want the spies to be getting their rocks off over a private conversation I was having with a long-distance partner. So the sense of privacy is very important on a personal level. And it's not just for that, it's for banking, it's for health records, it's for anything you do online, your whole life online. But also for society, it is crucial. Because if you feel that you are being watched, and I say this in Prague with its history, if you feel you're being watched by the secret state in what you read and what you download, what you write, who you are in a relationship with, who your friends are, what activities you might get up to, including political activism, as soon as you feel that is being watched, you begin to self-censor. And we know this because in the UK, this is a well-documented Snowden effect. 27% of adults in the UK now inhibit their activity online in case they are being watched. As soon as you have that situation, you lose a free and democratic society. As soon as you have that situation, you cannot push back or activate against policies of a government that you might not agree with. You worry that something might happen to you now, or you worry that perhaps the information will be held against you for years and used against you if the laws change. And if that sounds fanciful, well, we are Europeans. We've seen this happen in history time and time again. So I think that is a very fundamental, very crucial war against a concept that we are currently facing in Europe. However, I want to move on to the war on drugs. This is probably the first, and hopefully the first to go, war on a concept that I've seen globally. We have a situation where the UN treaties from 1961, 1971, and 1988 imposed this blanket prohibition of prescribed drugs across the planet. And the aim of this, of course, was to create a drug-free world. And it has been re-ratified again and again and again, up to and including 2012 at the UN, where they still said they wanted to aim for a drug-free world. Well, hands up anyone in this room who thinks that might be working. Okay. In those 50 years, drug use has gone up. Drug availability has gone rocketing up. The price has crashed, which anyone who knows anything about market forces knows that there's a lot of it out there. And there have been health issues, there's been breakdown in community spirit, a breakdown in trust between law enforcement and those who police and those who are policed. But on a global scale, it has caused so much harm, not just community scale, but globally it has caused so much harm. We have a situation where whole regions of the world have been devastated. There are the producer countries, the transit countries, where the drugs flow through, to the consumer countries. Let's guess, North America and Europe are the two key areas of consumption. The key producer countries in Latin America and Central Asia have been ravaged by drug cartel violence, by gangsterism, and even by terrorists fighting over this very lucrative form of income. The transit countries have been ripped apart in a way even more badly. I mean, one of the key corridors, for example, between Latin America and Europe now for cocaine is the northwest of Africa. Now, these countries have fallen into narco chaos over the last decade. These countries are basket cases. Countries like Mali or Guinea-Bissau, and Libya now as well, since NATO humanely liberated it a few years ago. All these countries are now transit countries to Europe, and all these countries now have warring militias fighting over this lucrative drug trade. And the population is being brutalized, it's being killed, it's being tortured. It's just a mess. Now, you might ask, why am I concerned about this with my strange MI5 background? One of the things I learned in the 1990s about the prohibition of drugs and the war on drugs was when I was working in MI5 for a section called T5. I was in charge of investigating terrorist logistics, which basically meant the movement of arms and people into and out of the UK. Now, to do this, I had to work very closely with customs. And I travelled all over the country, operations at ports, that sort of thing. And everywhere I went, the customs officers kept telling me that it was like looking for the proverbial needle in a haystack. They knew that the war on drugs was unwinnable. They knew that they wouldn't be able to stop it. I mean, this is an island country, and yet they still couldn't stop drugs getting into that island. In fact, they can't even stop drugs getting into the high-security prisons on that island. I also saw as well during that time, by investigating terrorist organizations, the massive overlap between the drug cartels, organized crime, and terrorist funding. In fact, it's estimated that over half the currently designated terrorist organizations around the world today get most of their funding from the illegal drug trade. So think about this. This is crazy. We have a situation where by prohibiting drugs, we create this global crime epidemic that garners between $320 billion and $500 billion per year in profits. And this goes straight into the hands of organized criminals and terrorists. Then on the other hand, as we're fighting the war on drugs, we then choose to fight the war on terrorism too. Those terrorist groups are being funded largely by the war, by the money coming from the illegal drug trade. So someone somewhere is making a lot of money out of this. It's almost a perfect business cycle. But it forgets about the human suffering, the national suffering, the violence, criminality, and terrorism that comes in its wake. This is why we in Law Enforcement Against Prohibition argue around the world about the need to end the war on drugs. It is a failed policy. It has been a failed policy for 50 years. And, to go with Einstein's definition of insanity, it is insane to do the same thing again and again and expect a different outcome. And yet this is what the UN, this is what our governments tell us to do. We need a rethink. And it's also about personal liberty as well. Who on earth came up with the idea that law enforcement, the police, should be out there policing our morals, our behaviors, our victimless activities? It's not a police role. Millions, billions of people use drugs every year around the world, and they don't develop any form of health issues. The 15% roughly who do don't deserve to be thrown in prison. They don't deserve to be criminalized or in some parts of the world executed for choosing to use something. They need potentially health interventions. That's it. Now, I have to say, of course, that in Europe we have made some good steps forward on this front over the last couple of decades. In fact, even America is beginning to look like it's coming to its senses, at least when it comes to the use of cannabis, where we have, I think, 22 states have legalized medicinal marijuana, and 5 states have legalized marijuana just for fun. Wow. And even in America, it's a very corporate type of model, but states like Colorado are garnering so many millions of tax dollars every year that they can now rebuild their failing infrastructures. They can invest in their education system. It's a good outcome on every metric. So it's becoming increasingly difficult for America to hold the moral high ground about morally fighting for the war on drugs. It's also increasingly difficult for our European countries to do that, because Europe has blazed a trail in a number of ways. Not necessarily the UK, where I come from, where it is a little bit backward, but many other countries have experimented with harm reduction, with decriminalization, which can only help those who choose to use drugs. We have a situation, of course, Switzerland in 1994, Switzerland, that well-known hippie enclave, decided in 1994 to provide safe injection rooms for heroin users, to make sure that they knew what dose they were taking, they could take their dose in a sterile and safe environment. And lo and behold, most of the social problems disappeared, and nobody overdoses in these facilities. It has been re-voted for and re-voted for over the last 22 years, with an increasing majority each time. And other countries across Europe have also developed this sort of approach. Ireland, most recently, again, not one of the most socially liberal countries in Europe, has started rolling out safe injection facilities. Also, Norway, Denmark, Germany, France, Luxembourg, where to stop? And Portugal, of course, most famously, decriminalised all drugs back in 2001, I think it was. Yeah. And in this situation, there were tales of projections of doom and gloom from the government saying, if we decriminalise drugs, we'll become a tourist hub. Use will go up, crime will go up, addiction will go up. It'll all be terrible, the sky will fall down on our heads. But it didn't happen like that. All the metrics since decriminalisation of all drugs, up to and including heroin, in Portugal, have been positive. Youth use has gone down, there is no drug tourism, crime has gone down, health outcomes have come up. It has been a raging success. So there are beacons of hope around the world. There's no doubt about it. Latin America, too, is pushing for reform, and that's why there's going to be a special session of the UN General Assembly in New York this April, pushed for by a bloc of Latin American countries. And Uruguay, famously, has legalized cannabis, totally. And again, different model from America. It's not corporate, it's state. But again, the outcomes seem to be positive. So there is hope, I think, around ending the war on drugs. It has been used and abused by the West, particularly America, for the last 50 years as a pretext to meddle and invade other countries. It has gone into many Latin American countries. It's meddled across the Central Asia, the Middle East, Africa, wherever. But I don't think they need the war on drugs anymore. I think this is one that we can win. We can end the madness that is prohibition. Because they have the war on terror now, which means they can go and meddle and bomb any country they want in the world, and that's much easier. So I do think there is hope. I think at the special session of the UN, there will be a stronger push globally towards harm reduction, not to criminalize people who choose to use, to see them as people who might need medical intervention, not throw them in prison. In some countries, I mean, Russia, Middle East, Central Asia is pretty draconian. But I think there will be progress. But that's not going fast enough and far enough. Because, of course, we shouldn't penalize those who choose to use. However, if we don't then take the next logical step, which is to legalize and regulate and control and tax the drug trade, we still leave that huge global crime wave in the hands of the criminals and the terrorists. And I have to say, what country, particularly in Europe, can afford not to think about regulation and taxing and control? Look at the model of Colorado I mentioned before, where they are garnering tens of millions of dollars per year in tax revenue just from the cannabis trade. In the UK, a study was done a few years ago which suggested if they legalized and taxed just cannabis, just one drug, within 1 year there would be a saving of £1.6 billion to the Treasury. 1.2 of that would be from tax coming into the Treasury. 170 million would be from the policing, 155 million from the judicial system, and 135 million from the prison system. Now, across Europe, we are being told we have to live in this era of austerity. We have to tighten our belts. How many of our countries really, realistically, cannot afford to have an adult, fact-based, evidence-based discussion around the rights and wrongs of prohibition, and to look at the alternatives to this egregiously failed policy? I would say now is the time that we have to do that. So just to conclude, Alfredo mentioned at the beginning, I'm the European Director for Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. This is a fairly new organization. It was only established in 2002 by 5 retired police officers in America. In that time, we've grown to a global organization with about 180,000 supporters and a presence in 120 countries. Our speakers come from the full range of law enforcement, from police to lawyers to judges to prison officers to prison governors to former spies, undercover officers, the whole range. And we all have professional experience on the issue of the war on drugs. And we all know from that professional perspective how badly it has failed, both on a global, a national, and a community level. We call for an end to the war on drugs. We call for an end to prohibition. One, to re-establish the trust between law enforcement and the communities. Law enforcement should be there to protect people from predators. It should not be there to police people's morality. We also want to end the illegal drug trade. We want to control what potentially are dangerous substances, rather than putting them in the hands of criminals who can then approach our children to do this, to use them. So, we have just launched LEAP UK in the Houses of Parliament last week in London. We launched LEAP in Germany last autumn in the Bundestag. And I'm very, very keen to try and find partners to help me identify other law enforcers in other European countries who might be interested in setting up LEAP chapters across Europe. We can add a unique voice to this debate because we're not, out there saying, hey, we want to smoke dope, free the weed. We are law enforcers, and we know that the war on drugs has failed. We know that prohibition has failed. We know it is time for a rethink. So if any of you can reach out and help LEAP, or you might have relatives, people like that, who are in law enforcement, who might be sympathetic, please do let me know. Because this is too big a topic just to carry on for another decade, another 2 decades, letting so many more lives be ruined, letting so much more violence continue around the world, and letting so much more terrorism be funded by this stupid prohibition law. So please reach out. LEAP is here to help. We can add a unique voice to this, and any support will be very gratefully received. Thank you very much.